So let's get down to the Bible readings, and then we can, go on and see where our conversation takes us. What I'm going to suggest is that we do Genesis 17, and instead of skipping it, because we have a little bit more time than we do in a Sunday service, we go verses 1 all the way through 16. And then if we really feel ambitious, we can talk a little bit about what happens afterwards. But I think that will get the main part. Pauline, do you want to read for us?
Yeah, sure. That's fine. Thank you. Okay, so Genesis 17. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Serve me faithfully and live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you by which I will guarantee to make you into a mighty nation. At this, Abram fell face down in the dust. Then God said to him, This is my covenant with you. I will make you the father of not just one nation, but a multitude of nations. What's more, I'm changing your name. It will no longer be Abram. Now you will be known as Abraham, for you will be the father of many nations. I will give you millions of descendants who will represent many nations. Kings will be among them. I will continue this everlasting covenant between us, generation after generation. It will continue between me and your offspring forever, and I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you. Yes, I will give all this land of Canaan to you and to your offspring forever, and I will be their God. Your part of the agreement, God told Abraham, is to obey the terms of the covenant. You and all your descendants have this continual responsibility. This is the covenant that you and your descendants must keep. Each male among you must be circumcised. The flesh of his foreskin must be cut off. This will be a sign that you and they have accepted this covenant. Every male child must be circumcised on the 8th day after his birth. This applies not only to members of your family, but also to the servants born in your household and the foreign-born servants whom you have purchased. All must be circumcised. Your bodies will thus bear the mark of my everlasting covenant. Anyone who refuses to be circumcised will be cut off from the covenant family for violating the covenant. Then God added, regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai. From now on, you will call her Sarah, and I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless you richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings will be among her descendants. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Sorry about some background noise. They're replacing the gas meter here, so it sounds like a jackhammer every once in a while, and I apologize for that. Okay, so what do you make of this? There's an awful lot going on. There's a promise made to Abraham. There's name changes. There's circumcision. There's a lot of things that all seem weird to us as modern people. So questions, comments, reflections?
I was noticing on mine, it has a couple of translations. It has Abraham as exalted father and Abraham as father of a multitude, which explains the name change.
Yeah.
And of course, being exalted father when he had no children must have been a bit of an embarrassment to him for years.
Yeah, and also even Abraham, he doesn't yet have the kid, right? So father of a multitude, again, it's like that's an act of faith by saying, okay, God, I'll do that. I had a commentator who commented that Abram and Abraham, it's like a multiplier, right? So father and then father of a multitude is sort of the way we do it in English. But he said, because he's a Southerner, he said it goes from daddy to big daddy, is how Abram's, but basically Abraham is like a multiplicator, like, would say good or better, or, shiny or shinier or shiniest. So that's kind of where he is. Pauline, did you want to say?
Didn't Abraham as Abram have a child Ishmael with Hagar?
Yes. He had it with Hagar, but not with Sarah. So you're right, he was already a father. But what God had promised is that he would have a son with his wife.
Of his own.
With his wife. And so this is what he's reiterating here.
Okay.
But you're right, he already is a father. And what also tends to get ignored too is after Sarah dies, Abram has some more children. So Midian, a few others. are still children of his by other women. So that guy's pretty active for
He's a busy boy.
over 100, considering pretty virile for a 100-year-old. Other comments or questions?
But maybe 100 wasn't 100 in our time. Like we have a year, maybe 100 wasn't.
Well, one of the
100
problems
years.
in ancient reckoning, for example, is like sometimes you'll find this in the Bible when it talks about angels. It'll say sometimes thousands upon thousands. Sometimes it'll say myriads upon myriads. Because myriad didn't, like, things weren't as exact in the past, right? So instead of saying exactly 1,000, you would say myriad, which means like a countless number. And myriads of myriads would mean thousands upon thousands, like a whole bunch. Just like you might say, like, I had took off a couple of days. It might mean 2 days, or it might mean it's just sort of generally a few, right? And it can be confusing. So that might be what's going on, but it also has to do with God providing long life to patriarchs. So you see Methuselah and all these others in the, parts of Genesis before the flood, for example. It's hard to know exactly what's going on with those, but either of the cases, though, both he and Sarah are told based on what we know, and Sarah particularly is past menopause, long past. We also see this too in Zechariah. Zechariah and Elizabeth, John the Baptist's parents, are too old to have kids by most reckoning, and yet there it is, it happens. John and Christine.
He did question, because of the ages, how she could have this child, which is understandable.
Yep.
I think we'd all question if I felt pregnant, I'd say this is ridiculous, look at my age, but it's God has a purpose in all he does.
Yep.
We don't always see that purpose at the time when we first read it.
Sure. Yeah, I know the thing that's interesting too here you have Abram right after, so verse 17, he fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, can a child be born to a man who's 100 years old? And then what's interesting is it isn't just Abraham scoffing. In chapter 18, we find Sarah doing the same thing. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, they both do.
And what's also, so both of them are doubting this. And that's actually, if you remember why he has Ishmael to begin with, it wasn't Abram's idea, it was Sarah's idea. Like God promises child, clearly he doesn't mean you and me, because that just wouldn't happen. So let's have Ishmael, or here's Hagar, my slave. And that would be sort of a typical thing, unfortunately, in the ancient world. As a slave, you are the property of the woman, and so she can do with you what she wants. And so you have the child, and it'll be mine. And unfortunately, that was a typical thing. A slave is a piece of property, just like, if you have a cat, and the cat has kittens, they're your kittens, right? And unfortunately, that's how people saw it. So,
John, that's something.
Yeah.
John, and then Elizabeth.
This is the chapter that establishes God's covenant with the people of Israel, or the tribe of Abraham. And to this day, his people are still established in the area that he designated Palestine, as it used to be known in those days. It's rather interesting that apart from the Babylonian period, when they were taken into captivity in the days of Daniel, I believe, this has not, this covenant has been established for all the periods since that time. Now, I'm not quite sure exactly what period this was established, but certainly it's earlier on in the creation. So it's one of the wonders of our Godhead that he has really committed himself to his people. I think that's a singular understanding of this, that he's still our God.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's important for us to note is it's not that God invalidates his covenant with Abram and eventually Abraham, it's that he includes others into it. So it's not like he says, okay, Abraham, I'm done with you and your descendants. What he says is that we become spiritual descendants. The other thing that's interesting too, and we sometimes forget, is Abraham has many children. One of them is Ishmael, one of them is Isaac, but we're also, I just looked it up here, Abraham took another wife in chapter 25, whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. So he's got several kids. And one of the things that's interesting is that when you get into Deuteronomy and Joshua and Numbers, you see the Israelites wandering around, and God is clear to them and saying, don't take the lands of the Edomites, because Edom is a descendant of Abraham as well. So that's part of the promise goes to him. Same thing with the Midianites. So Midian, so they aren't Jews in the technical sense that descendants of Isaac and actually the descendants of Jacob are, but they're people who are sons of Abraham. Same with the Ishmaelites. So, and there's also too even the Moabites, who are descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot. To find that Ruth, for example, as a Moabite, becomes one of the ancestors of King David. So even within that promise to Abraham, it's not just the Jewish people that it's limited to. It also includes some others, and it's very clear that God tells them not to take away the land, that they're part of this inheritance. So what's also interesting too is God binding himself to Abram. Abram's a nobody, right? I mean, it's sort of, we know it because of generations afterwards, but chapter 12 of Genesis is where he picks out Abram. And it's just a guy who is sort of maybe a tribal chieftain living in Ur. And at the time, this was a time in which the old Babylonian Empire, the old Assyrian Empire, the Sumerians, like these are the great empires of the day. Nobody would have paid any attention to Abram. He was just a nobody. And yet God chooses him and says, all these great empires I could choose to make a covenant with, and make it with you. And part of what Abram has to do is to say, like, really? Like the God of heaven and earth is coming and appearing to me and making a covenant, and I got to go to this new place? Why would he pick me out when there's like massive kings, kingdoms, things that would make God proud? You know, Egypt had been a grand civilization for thousands of years at this point. So anyway, all that is to say is that it's just to understand how amazing it is that God makes this covenant, that he honors it from generation to generation, and we are still benefactors of this, even though we're not, of course, physically descendants of Abraham. Elizabeth, you had a comment.
Yes, sort of back to Sarah and Abraham and having a child at that age. Of course, the one thing that for Sarah was she had servants. She wasn't going to be stuck at age, so the age I am with a baby, which, you know, thank you very much. I don't think I could handle it. I know I couldn't handle it. But, you know, if you have all these servants around, it's somewhat easier.
It is, and it's also just partly because of her age. It's really important she had servants, but partly also because our culture is quite different in that we're sort of the nuclear family. You have a baby and you're kind of in your house by yourself looking after the baby. Almost everybody in human history had a larger extended family, which meant that you would have a midwife amongst the extended family. You would have aunts and uncles to look after the kids. You'd have lots of different things that were there. And it would have been much, much more expected that this is a group effort. So
Takes a city to raise a child.
yeah, exactly. You know, we've forgotten that, and I think we're getting back to that. I think it's more people are aware that this isolated life is not what we're made for. A few observations I wanted to make, if that's okay with you. One of the things that's interesting is that the name change is something that indicates like a new identity, a new foundation. This often happens in the Bible. You know, famously, Jacob, after wrestling with God, has his name changed by God to Israel, which means wrestles with God. So this says something. He doesn't leave his, like we still mention Jacob later, but we call them Israelites because there's some essential part of who he is, which is the one who wrestles with God, and the nation wrestles with God. We also find, that names have real significance in the way that they don't now. A lot of times in English culture, at least, a name just is a signifier. It sounds nice. Or maybe because it recognizes I'm named after my uncle or something like that. But there, the name would matter a lot and be some kind of recognition of a person's character. So it's interesting also that Sarah is included in this. So Abraham gets a new name, Sarah gets a new name. So there's this thing that was not common in the Middle East, even today in many parts of the world, where God is making a covenant with a woman as well. She is an essential part of this whole process. She has an identity as named by God and given a new name. We'll find this later when God speaks to Hagar. These are not typical. Women were property basically in the ancient world, and God treats each of these women, Hagar and Sarah, as individuals, as persons with their own decision making, and gives them a new identity. So that's really important. Another thing interesting too is there's a few things to note. God keeps reiterating this covenant. I mentioned in Genesis 12 is the first time Abram is called, and God says, I'll make a great nation, all of this. He keeps repeating it. And so we find some things are added, but it's almost as if Abram is still taking a while for him to let it sink in. And you think about how both Abraham and Sarah both laugh. They still haven't quite gotten the seriousness of what God's covenant is, the power that God has, and his longstanding commitment. He didn't sort of say, "Oh yeah, I forgot I made that promise to you, Abram. Thanks for reminding me." Because of course you think about idolatry, and what happened with idolatry was like you're basically it's sort of, if you think about how an idol works, it's sort of like our Zoom call right now, right? Which is we're on a Zoom call with each other, and an ancient person would have an idol, and the god might show up on your little idol Zoom call, or he might not show up. And if you're just a nobody and you put out a bowl of porridge for this idol, is he going to come and visit you, or is he going to go to the king's idol where here's a rack of lamb and a Beaujolais and here's all these things? So you think, it seems silly to us, but it would have been like an idol would come to you and say, well, what do I get out of this deal? And Abram and Sarah would probably have that because they were pagan past, coming up with, what do I really have to offer this God? Is he really gonna stretch out? Is he really gonna commit himself to me? When the Pharaoh is laying out banquets for all of his gods, and what do I got? Not much. So I think that's part of what's going on, is what the lack of believability is that the gods of the ancient world just did not care about human beings at all, and especially didn't care about little human beings. So again, it's amazing that God speaks to Hagar, a slave woman who's been cast out with her slave son, and speaks to them and says, I'm going to pay attention to you. Because God does not care about slaves. Slaves are nobodies. So the best you can get is one of the really minor gods who pays some attention. But like the most high God, the God of heaven and earth, to pay attention, pretty unlikely. Christine, you had a comment.
It's interesting, as just listening to you, what you were saying, that this is from the beginning of Genesis, how the people God put in front of him disobeyed him and questioned him right through the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. If we think of Moses and the children of going through the desert and through the water, and how they questioned and didn't believe what Moses was saying. And this is what's happening today. It's people are just not listening, and we have to start listening to what the Holy Spirit is telling us.
But it does say something about the constancy of human nature, right? Which is, we have a vastly different world than the ancient people did, but we're still human beings, right? And it means that we still have sin reigning in our members. We still have temptations. They're different temptations. The root, they're often the same. So, the temptations with lust and gluttony and, pride, all these things that are very obvious in the Old Testament, like they're pretty obvious now. Just go onto Instagram and look at pride and look at greed. Look at all of these things. And then again, don't just look on Instagram, look in the mirror and say, what areas am I conveniently ignoring God? Oh God, thank you for not letting me be a murderer, a fornicator, and that. But we forget God may be saying, oh, and yet at the same time you're greedy or you're whatever else it is. Like we're just the same as our ancestors in that respect. A few things I wanted to mention too. Again, the multitude. And look at verse 4. So Abraham fell on his face. So that's a prostration, and that will happen sometimes. You see, even you bow to the king. That's just an echo of the way it would have been. You would have laid down flat to your face in front of a king. But he says, as for me, this is my covenant with you, you shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. So you understand here, he's not just saying you're going to have a big nation. You're going to have nations. So I did mention to you Midian, Edomites, lots of those nations, but also the nations, right? So in Hebrew, whenever you see the translation Gentiles, that in Hebrew would be the nations, which means basically all of the people outside of Israel. We're the nations, right? Isaiah is very good and strong in this, but even from the beginning, that you will be a blessing to the nations, which means all of these people that are worshiping idols who don't know who Yahweh, the God of Israel, is, you will be blessed through Abraham. And of course, we are looking forward to Jesus and saying, well, that's the source of the blessing. That God came and through an ancestor of Abraham and opened the way for you and me and all the Gentiles to come to God without having to become an Israelite. One of the things that we read, which is left out in the lectionary, is how to become an Israelite and about the rite of circumcision. And that's the battle that Paul has again and again in the churches, is that he goes out and when people are Christians, the question is, do you have to become a Jew first and then become a Christian? Or can you become a Christian without first becoming a Jew? And it's interesting because we tend to forget this because so much of the church is Gentile. Paul never says to Jews, stop circumcising your kids. What he's arguing about is don't make Gentiles do it. Like if you are a Jew and you're following Abraham and the covenant, you don't have to stop being a Jew. What you have to start doing is assuming the Gentiles have to become a Jew in order to become a faithful follower of Jesus. So anyway, so there's that. Here's another interesting thing, though, as we're talking about circumcision. Like I know I feel squeamish talking about it just like all of you would, but it's there all the time in Scripture, so we'll have to talk about it a bit. What do you think the deal is about circumcision? Like why, amongst all the things God could choose, why is this a deal for God and continues to be for generations afterwards? Pauline.
I think from what I've been reading, it's because if having circumcision is a way of showing God that you have complete faith in him. If you're willing to do that, that's a pretty significant act to do, and it's irreversible. So like once it's done and you've had faith in God, it's pretty hard to delete your faith and say, sorry, but I'm not going to do this anymore.
Yep.
I think maybe that's all part of
so
that.
that it's indelible nature, it's unchangeable.
Yeah.
Christine.
Well, I think it's automatic for certain people to have their male baby circumcised for a reason, not what this is the reason is because of being a Jew and being a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean to say that because this male child has not been circumcised, it cannot be born of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's John and I were in Turkey, and the teenage boys who were being taken, why is this happening? And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, but they weren't doing it for the reason that needed to be done, that to bring him into a loving relationship with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean,
Doing it.
I think that there's reasons. I mean, for a long time, circumcision was sort of the normal thing for little boys in North America for hygienic reasons, right? So there's different reasons. There's also in other cultures, the Egyptians practiced circumcision of some sort as well. So there's different reasons people do it, but it's clear here, and especially the symbolism of the eighth day. So we notice even today, we celebrate the naming and circumcision of Jesus 8 days after Christmas, which happens to be New Year's Day. So that's a following that goes all the way back here to Abram. And so there's a very conscious attempt on the part of Jewish people to say, we identify with Abraham, we want to be heirs of the promise of Abraham, and we do not want to be cut off from our people. Over time, once Exodus occurs and the Passover meal is instituted, that was the signifier. Like if you are a Gentile, you could live in Egypt, live in Israel, live amongst the people, but only if you were circumcised could you participate in the Passover meal. And so one of the big reasons that it changed for Gentiles is that for us, Christ our Passover sacrificed for us. Easter is mentioned as Easter in English, but most languages use some version of Passover, the Pasch in French or Pascha. These are all Passover. And so if it's the Christian Passover, the question was, to participate, you need to be circumcised. And the church recognized early on that baptism forms the barrier, not circumcision. So there's a difference there. One of the things that baptism is that it's universal. It's men and women, not just little boys. So it's not just boys who are the ones who are, grow up and represent their family. It's the parents both. So that's part of what's going on there. But also Paul, when he's reaching people, he's again saying to the Galatians and others, like, the reason why you're being circumcised matters. If you think that's the only way to enter into union with Christ, then you're doing it for the wrong reason, because we enter into union through the work of the Holy Spirit and signified by our baptism. Pauline, you had a question.
It was probably a silly question, but how would they know if males were invited to attend some kind of ceremony? And do they have a piece of paper to say, hey, I've been circumcised? Or do they just trust the fact that the people don't dare come unless they have been? Like,
my guess would be the context, right? So
I don't know what's the deal.
most of Israel's history would be in small communities where you would know this is a Jewish family and they had their son circumcised, right? What you would have when it's in doubt, you would go into a little room and drop your pants. That's how you would find out. And I know it would be very awkward, but that's how it was.
Okay.
We also know early church history up until the time of sort of Christianity became the official religion of the empire in the 4th century. You'd be baptized naked. And so why you still, even today in England, call Pentecost Whit Sunday, was because you would take off your clothes, you would be baptized, and you'd be given a white robe to wear when you came to church. And that would continue on until Pentecost. So all these practices, weird to us, I get it. But again, to a pagan culture, it would not have been so weird, because you would have seen a lot of bodily stuff, right? I mean, the reality is that some pagan cults, you would cut yourself. Some pagan cults, you would, even today, weird Wiccan stuff where people wear robes and are, nudities involved. That would be very different. It would be much more of a safe thing. It would be a single sex thing. It wouldn't be a mixed. But that even happens now with, I think it's called the mikvah. But when you do a ritual washing, you will have it strictly in Orthodox Judaism, separation between men and women. And you'd have women attendants who would be there when you're doing a ritual washing, and women would take off their clothes and bathe and get out and put on new clothes as part of that ritual. Female attendants, and men would have men attendants in a separate place, and that's what we would have. But in the general run of things, it would be because you have it testified, your family said, oh yes, you were circumcised. The other reality is that Jewish people knew from early on that some children are hemophiliacs, and we know from ancient records that if you had a history of hemophilia, you would be exempted from having a circumcision, and you would basically have an attestation by the rabbi saying, this person is not circumcised, but they would like to, they just can't because they can't be cut. So that would have happened as well.
Okay, thank you.
One thing again, which again is a little squeamish, but so part of it's indelible. So circumcision is something that can't be reversed. But there are other things, right? Like which is you could get a tattoo, and that would be a thing that's not really reversible. Although you could, brand yourself theoretically. One of the reasons is that when you think about which part of the body is circumcised and where this rite of circumcision comes, it comes in the context of Abraham being told by God, you will be a father of nations. So part of it has a sexual context, which is to say that your sexual life is not simply your own. It's not simply for pleasure. What your sexual life is, and particularly why it's a man who has this, is the assumption was in the ancient world that children are born through male initiative. The father has the right or the husband has the right to sleep with his wife as often and whatever he wants. And the assumption would be that by Abram and all Jewish boys having that circumcision is, in fact, your sexual life is not your own. You are a person whose sexual life is consecrated to God. And that means not only in the way that you use your sexuality in a non-immoral way, but also that your generation of children is part of what your responsibility is to God. Now, Jesus says, Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. So Abraham probably had some inkling of Jesus coming, the Messiah coming, but not everybody would have. But of course, we know in retrospect that part of what the Jewish responsibility was and why they had a responsibility to have kids was they were going to produce Jesus, produce the Messiah. So not want to get into too much details, but part of what that idea around circumcision is to tell Abram and to tell all of the Jewish men that their sexuality is not just a pleasure thing, not just their own will. In fact, their own sexuality and their fatherhood and parenting are in fact in submission to God. So there's that value as well when we think about baptism. Is the idea is that the whole self, the old person, the old Adam is drowned and a new Adam is created through Christ's ministry to us. It's not just our sexuality that's being emphasized, it's our whole self. And it's not just men, it's men and women, that you are consecrated to God. So this is a foreshadowing of what baptism will bring, but it's a sense that this area of your life, that it isn't just the male privilege that everybody would have assumed in the ancient world. This is in fact divine privilege, and God places this under obedience and faithfulness to him. So I think that's part of what's going on. Anyway, so that's there's a lot more that could be talked about. Do you want to come and take a look at the gospel reading for the time that we still have, or do you have any other questions about this Genesis portion? Okay. So let's look at Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, beginning at verse 31. Let's see here. Mark 8, verse 31, and it goes on to chapter 9, verse 1. Who would like to read for us today? Sarah, do you want to read for us? So it's 8:31 up to 9:1.
Sure, I'd love to. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." And he said to them, "Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to
Thanks
God.
be to God.
So again, content filled. Just to place it in perspective, this is happening right before the Transfiguration. So we saw that, I guess, a week and a half ago. The Transfiguration was read again. And this happens in the immediate lead up to it. So questions, comments, reflections?
Was Abraham at the Transfiguration?
No, it was Moses and Elijah.
Moses and Elijah. Thank you.
Elizabeth.
And it's Peter once again. It's always Peter who poor Peter. He has, and then this great change comes over him on the Pentecost when he finally gets it at last.
Yeah, it's funny. Do you remember there were always these sort of like Abbott and Costello and others that you had the straight man and the funny man? And the straight man and the funny man would always be the one who gets everything wrong and has to always be explained, like the who's on first. I sometimes think of that about Peter and Jesus, right? Jesus is a straight man making it clear, and Peter's like, sorry, who's on first again? But again, it's an effective technique in that I'm sure Peter wasn't always clueless. But the Gospels point out his cluelessness partly because he is standing in the place where we would have been, right? Which is Peter puts his foot in it, but I think we would have, right? It's like, you just say he's the Messiah, and then Jesus says, okay, have you ever seen a crucifixion and how awful it is? You're going to have to do the same thing. What? Sorry? I thought I had said that I was wanting to follow the winner who was going to be a champion. What are you talking about a cross? Like, I think none of us would have said, oh, great, Jesus, lead me to the cross. And even now, of course, we forget the horror of what the cross was, how shameful it was. And so when Jesus is talking about this, and then later on saying those who are ashamed of me, he's talking about something real, which is this is shameful. And you don't want to be associated with this guy who was humiliated, whipped, beaten, spit upon, crucified, died alongside of two criminals. Do I want to be associated with this guy? And that's what he's talking about, is a very real fear that people will be ashamed of him. But, Peter is the one who, again, often says what we would have been thinking. And we're tempted to judge Peter for being, oh man, there's Peter again, instead of asking. Same thing with the denial. Like, I'd never deny you, Jesus. That's how I feel most of the time. But then would I? Like, if my, Roman soldier questions me, would I really be saying, yeah, that's my savior? Or would I be running away? Right? I don't know. We don't know until the moment of truth. What's, of course, great of his character arc and how, in the end, in John 21, Peter is confronted by Jesus 3 times because of the 3 denials, and 3 times Jesus gives him a new task and says, one time you will be led to a place that you do not want to go, but then you're not going to deny me then. And then Peter, by tradition, was crucified himself for following Jesus. Pauline.
I think it's interesting that Peter, James, and John, I think were kind of
the inner circle,
a bit of the inner circle of Jesus' 12. I think they had a little more responsibility and clout. It's amazing that he even kept Peter with him for all the zany big ideas that Peter has about doing everything. He always wants everything to be bigger and better than anybody else. And I'm surprised that Jesus kept him as one of those 3 of the inner circle.
There again, Peter's standing in our place, which is we can look at Peter and find comfort that here's a guy who perpetually doesn't get it. And yet Jesus still says, I want you part of the inner circle. But I also wonder too, like I know we probably all have experience as sort of the lovable rogue as well, like the guy at the ne'er-do-well that you love being around, right? The guy who tells off-color jokes or whatever it is, and yet at the same time you can't help but love him because he's got a really big heart. And I wonder whether Peter seems like that kind of guy. It's also, I find it interesting too that I don't know, it never mentions it, but I wonder how Andrew felt about it, right? Because Peter and Andrew called at the same time. James and John are called at the same time. And then when Jesus calls the inner circle, he brings Peter, he brings James, he brings John, and leaves Andrew out. And I wonder whether Andrew was kind of frustrated by this. Because Andrew is also the first. He's the one who we learn was following John the Baptist. then followed Jesus after John pointed him to it, and then introduced Peter to Jesus. So Andrew is like the first called, and then I don't know. But having said that as well, it's helpful for us to know and to remember that God may call people to prominent leadership, not because they're the most mature, but because he wants them to grow up. And I often find it encouraging to say, like, God looked out and said, who's the most capable, competent person in this diocese? Oh, Stephen, he's the guy. In fact, what it may be is the opposite. It's like, who's the guy who most needs to grow up? And picks him. And I often think of that old saying, like, if you want to learn something, teach it. It's like, it may be that the only reason that I actually got into the Bible and focus on the things I do is because I have to. Whereas other people may love the Bible from the day they were born, always feel compelled to do this. And so they're doing great as a plumber or whatever, and a faithful father and husband or something. So don't make the mistake that God chose the most competent. Peter clearly is incompetent in lots of ways and may have chosen him for his own reasons and not because of Peter's inherent qualities. Other points or questions that you've got, Sarah?
I was just thinking the other day about, is it possible to be a disciple without discipline?
Well, the names are related, disciple and discipline. So it's following a path set for you. But I think there has to be a discipline, right? Which is, Jesus says, if anyone would follow me, they must deny themselves, take up the cross, and follow me. Or if anyone wishes to be my disciple, they must do this. So there is this sense that you have to have at least the first steps of a discipline. But of course, the great joy of that is that discipline, that power to do these things comes from Christ himself. So even the desire to follow Jesus, like I think it was the Jairus, and his daughter was ill. And Jesus says, do you believe? And he says, I believe, help my unbelief, which is like, I want to believe. I'm not sure if I believe enough, but I'm not going to be able to believe enough unless you help me. So that's interesting too, that Paul, you may have read our bulletin handout about the gift of faith in Lent, our stewardship commitment to stewarding our gifts. It's interesting that faith is a gift. You sort of think faith comes, I have faith, and then he opens the doors and gives me gifts. It's like even faith is a gift, which is an amazing thing. So what that really signals to us is not, man, do you got it takes, the few and the proud like the Marines. Instead, it's, are you humble enough to receive? I want to receive the gift of faith. I want to receive discipline. And then you put it into practice. But in the end, the initiative all comes with Jesus. Our job is simply to receive, say yes, and follow. And then when we stumble, to say, need more help here. And then Jesus will help you up. And that's really the dynamic that I think is being modeled for us. Peter does a good job of that. Christine, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking what you just said about your sermon on Sunday. It was a great sermon about temptation and how, thank you for it.
You're welcome.
But I think we're tempted in our lives, and God gave us an out when he went into the wilderness for 40 days. And I was sitting listening to you with your sermon. I'm thinking, oh yeah, we all deal with this. And what do? We don't always realize that there's somebody there that we need to get rid of. And God and Jesus gave us an out there that he told Satan to bug off, go. And we have to do the same.
Well, Peter says, rebuke the devil and he will flee from you, right?
Yeah.
And, we can't rebuke the devil in our own power. What could we do? But we do have the power of the Lord. And again, one of the things I love about the baptismal rite is the chrismation, which is I put the sign of the cross, and then I say, I sign you with the cross to mark you as Christ's own forever. The devil has no claim on us, right? He says that. He says, oh, there's parts of you that belong to me. Nothing of us belongs to him. We talked about how, Abram's sexuality was something that was given over to God as shown and signified by circumcision. And also how baptism means that our whole lives are given over, which means all of us belong. And so, like, one of the great things that the prayer book had at the end is after you receive, you say, and here we present and we give and present unto thee, O Lord, ourselves, our souls and bodies to be a holy, living and acceptable sacrifice unto thee. And although unworthy, anyway, all that is to say that we understand what the calling is, the whole self. And where we make the mistake is thinking the whole self means, oh, it's drudgery. Like, oh, he's going to tell me I got to clean toilets or I got to do whatever. Like, maybe that's part of it. Well, we all got to do difficult things. But the joy of the Lord is in service. And part of the trust is to say, man, this sounds tough, like carrying a cross. Ugh. To believe that in fact it can be a joyful, but above all meaningful and satisfying action is really, really important to us. But also just, Jesus didn't sin, but remember he stumbled while he was carrying the cross. So his physical strength came to an end. And he had, Simon of Cyrene come and carry it for him a bit. It's just amazing to me that the church, who acknowledged Jesus as the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, was willing to acknowledge his humility, his weaknesses, his shameful death. That's a scandal. And again, why Jesus would say, don't be ashamed of me. It's like so easy. Paul says it's foolishness to the Greeks. He says it because Greeks would say, what are you talking about? We're serving Zeus, like the mighty conqueror who never suffers defeat. But instead, it says, no, serve this guy that the Romans thought was some loser. Why do we follow? Well, it's not that he's a loser. He conquers the grave by taking on humility and taking on the form of a servant. And that should encourage us to say, like, he's not ashamed of us. Like, we shouldn't be ashamed of him. But he does all this so that we would not feel like we have to be ashamed. That when we stumble physically, as Jesus did on the cross, or when we stumble morally, like Peter and the disciples did, there's still a place for us in his kingdom. And that's the great thing about Lent too, is part of it is we think, oh, it's conquering over all these things. Part of it is learning to own our failures, right? I read a book in the time I spent a couple of weeks ago. I spent a few days at a monastery, and I was reading on the Rule of St. Benedict, a commentary on it. And the guy who's writing it, a monk, said he was at a retreat, and he was surprised because one of the monks he dropped something and he swore while he did it. And then he asked the monk about it, and he said, it's true, I haven't ever been able to bite my tongue the way I should. But he said, one thing I've learned as a monk is that I used to be embarrassed of my weaknesses, and now I glory in them. In other words, it's almost as if it was a badge of honor to say, yeah, God still accepts foul-mouthed monks. He still accepts this. He still accepts this. And you can take it the wrong way and sort of say, well, therefore I'm going to be a jerk. But at the same time, there's some real truth about saying, like, God knows you're going to fail. Part of what you're going to do in Lent is to fail and learn how to fail forward. Say, okay, I'm not going to be ashamed that I fell. I'm going to acknowledge it before God and say, you chose a very weak, broken vessel, God. But I'm going to trust you knew what you were getting into when you called me, and that you were using this to help me grow. And I know that I'm going to be victorious because my weakness, your strength can show through my weakness. Because we just get into the habit of despising our own weakness when God, in fact, says, yeah, I know you're weak. The question is not whether you're weak or not. The question is whether you let my strength work through it. So, Christine, you'll get the last word, and then we'll close with prayer because we're just about up to our end time.
It's a bit like a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Letting a child do something they've never done before.
Yeah.
And you're standing there watching them and they fail. And you say to them, don't get disheartened and just try again. Because it will take time for you to learn to do it the way it needs to be done. Just don't give up.
Don't let it crush you, right? It's easy for me to say, but it's like, you fell off your bike. So what? Get up.
Get up,
what do you
get
expect?
back on.
Yeah, you get back on. It's like, what do you honestly expect? That you're just going to get on the bike and for the first time in history, a person succeeds, and has been an Olympic cyclist the moment he gets on a bike. Like, it's ridiculous. But a lot of times we're afraid of doing things because we're afraid of failure. And that's just not God talking to you. It's the devil. Pauline.
And can I just take a moment and share with you a book that I'm reading for those of you who might be interested? I don't know. It's called The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren. Some of you may have seen it or read it. Yep. I'm really enjoying it. The chapters are short. It kind of tells you where your life is going and how all the pieces of your life fit together. And And it's a most interesting book and a very easy read. Little questions at the end of it sometimes, and little Bible verses for you to refer to. Anyway, it's called The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren. So
It's
just
a good Lenten read. Yeah, I did a or a book study on that about 15 years ago.
we did too. It's a great book. I'm
Yeah.
going back to it after having read it before, underlining
It's a sign
lots
of a
of
good book. You want to go back to it again. By the way, today, if you can, come to our evening movie night. The Secret Garden's one of those books, or is Secret Garden is the movie. The book is better, of course, but Maggie Smith is in this. She's fantastic. Lots of good actors. Anyway, it's one of those books that I read for the first time when I had children myself. I love reading it as an adult. And some of the best books are the ones, children's books are the ones that you love reading as an adult. Anne of Green Gables is like that too. I love rereading it. I also, Alice in Wonderland is like that. A lot of the classics, Treasure Island several times. But anyway, Secret Garden has a lot more Christian content. So if you're able to come,
it's a classic.
it is a classic.
Read
And there's
the
been a
book
few
and
versions.
We
Go ahead.
have the same movies you're going to show
Yeah.
tonight, but we've seen the other movies too.
Anyway, I'm noticing I only got 3 minutes, so we're going to close in prayer. But we'll be back again next week. And don't forget that if you're coming, and I hope you are on Sunday, it's only one service. It's at 10 o'clock. And it'll be a special service of confirmation and Thanksgiving for our parish, and then potluck after. Lord, thank you for all you give to us. Thank you for this gift of your word, which fills us in so many ways. We just sort of ran through all of this because there was so much content, such a feast that you lay out before us. But help us to chew over these things, to mark and learn and inwardly digest them, so that as we think about and reflect on what your word means, that it might continue to feed us in the coming days. Help us to remember that though we stumble and fall, you're always with us, that you love us. You love nothing more than to see those who stumble find over time that they're more able to walk. Help us to walk faithfully with you and be with everybody who's not present with us. In Christ's name, amen.
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 Bye-bye,
Bye,
everybody. And
everybody.
Sarah, if you could send me that note again, I'll pass it on to Daniel.
I'll do that right now. Thank you.
have a good
Bye.
week. See you Sunday.
You too.